Police had a lead that pointed toward one of their own. Sherri Rasmussen's family had warned investigators about a former girlfriend connected to the Los Angeles Police Department. A biological sample had been preserved from Sherri's body. Yet for 23 years, the case remained inside a burglary theory. This is the story of what finally forced that theory to collapse, and what the DNA still could not explain. The most famous image in this case is an interview room. Stephanie Lazarus, by then an LAPD detective, sits across from other officers as their questions narrow toward Sherri. But that footage is not the breakthrough. Before Lazarus entered the room, investigators had already recovered her discarded cup and straw. The DNA had already brought them to her. The interview was a consequence of the evidence, not a substitute for it. Before the theories, the evidence boxes, and the interview, there was Sherri. She worked as a nurse. She had recently married John Rutan. On February 24, 1986, John returned to their home in Van Nuys and found that Sherri had been killed. The violence would dominate the case file, but it should not become her identity. Sherri was a person with work, relationships, parents, and a future that ended inside a story investigators believed they already understood. The house appeared disturbed, property seemed to have been targeted, and Sherri's car was gone. The original detectives concluded that burglars had entered the home and that Sherri had surprised them. That theory gave the scene an immediate shape, a residential crime that had turned lethal. Once accepted, it also determined which facts looked central, which people looked peripheral, and which questions seemed unnecessary. A theory can organize an investigation. It can also narrow one. Under the burglary frame, the missing car and disturbed home made sense as the main path. A personal conflict did not. That does not prove anyone deliberately buried another explanation. It shows something more ordinary and, in its own way, more troubling. Once the case had been named, information that did not fit the name could lose its urgency. John told investigators that Stephanie Lazarus was a former girlfriend. Sherri's parents also urged police to examine the former girlfriend and officer direction. Their information did not contain the later DNA result, and it was not a conviction waiting to happen. But it was a specific personal lead, one tied to a past relationship and to a police officer, that competed directly with the idea of anonymous burglars. The later court record describes follow-up that did not happen promptly. People connected to the former girlfriend lead were not interviewed when their information might have tested the burglary theory. Years passed. Lazarus continued her career inside LAPD. The point is not that her badge proved guilt. The point is that the lead existed. The badge made the institutional context unavoidable, and the investigation did not seriously resolve the conflict between that lead and its original theory. This is where the story requires discipline. Sherri's family later alleged that LAPD had incompetently, or maliciously, failed to investigate one of its own. A trial judge found the defense account of police negligence plausible, but neither point proves an intentional departmental cover-up. The record supports a failure to pursue important information. It supports the consequences of tunnel vision. It does not let us invent the motive behind that failure. The part of the case that escaped the burglary theory was physical. During the original examination, a swab was taken from a bite injury on Sherri's arm. It was sealed, stored, and preserved in a freezer. Investigators in 1986 could not ask that sample the same questions a modern laboratory could. But because the sample remained, the old investigation did not have the final word. In December 2004, LAPD's cold case unit reopened Sherri's murder. This did not begin with an interrogation. It began with the surviving evidence. The bite swab had spent almost 19 years outlasting assumptions, personnel changes, and the practical limits of the original era. The question was no longer whether the 1986 theory felt plausible. It was whether the preserved biology agreed with it. Testing in 2005 produced a major female DNA profile. That changed the logic of the case, but it did not yet provide a name. A database search found no match. The result was both powerful and incomplete. It challenged the assumption of anonymous male burglars, while leaving investigators with the harder task of returning to the people and relationships the first theory had pushed aside. By 2009, investigators were reviewing women connected to John and to the old case. The female profile did not identify anyone by itself. It changed who could be compared with the preserved evidence. That brought investigators to Stephanie Lazarus, a former girlfriend John had named to police years earlier. Now the old personal lead and the surviving biology could finally be tested against each other. Investigators followed Lazarus and recovered a cup and straw after she discarded them. The resulting partial DNA profile matched the preserved bite-swab profile at the available loci. This was the operational turn. The sample did not speak through expression or hesitation. It linked a named person to biological evidence kept from Sherri's body since 1986. After Lazarus was arrested, investigators obtained a direct mouth swab. That profile matched at all 15 tested loci. The distinction matters. The discarded cup and straw gave investigators the lead they could act on. The direct sample confirmed the comparison after arrest. Keeping those steps separate shows why the case moved and prevents one dramatic scene from swallowing the evidence chain. On June 5, 2009, investigators brought Lazarus into an interview under a pretext and told her she was not under arrest and was free to leave. The recording is valuable when it shows the questions investigators chose, what Lazarus said, and how the case moved toward arrest. It is not a license to diagnose guilt from a pause, a smile, a posture, or a change in tone. The DNA carries the evidentiary weight. Lazarus was arrested that day. In 2012, a jury convicted her of first-degree murder. The court imposed a sentence totaling 27 years to life, and the California Court of Appeal later affirmed the conviction. The legal result resolved who was held responsible for Sherri's murder. It did not return the lost years, and it did not make the original investigative choices disappear. The second revelation is not another name. It is what the DNA made visible about the lost years. The evidence established who was responsible, then forced the old investigation to be judged against a personal lead that had existed before the science could identify anyone. Sherri's family had pointed police toward that connection. Once the match was made, the cost of not resolving it earlier could no longer remain abstract. The courts kept the boundary narrow. The trial court found a negligence account plausible, while also recognizing that the decisive DNA result could not have been produced in 1986. Later litigation included allegations of concealment, but an allegation analyzed by a court is not a historical finding. The record supports a missed lead and a wrong theory. It does not establish why the lead went unresolved. The criminal case remains resolved. In February 2025, California's official hearing results recorded a 3-year parole denial for Lazarus. That current status belongs at the edge of the story, not at its center. The center remains Sherri, the evidence that was preserved, and the family members who spent decades asking investigators to look beyond the explanation chosen in the first days. A preserved sample eventually did what the original theory could not. It forced the investigation to test a lead that had been there from the beginning. That is why the interview should not own this case. The interview shows a suspect confronting questions. The evidence shows how the case changed, and Sherri's family shows what the delay cost. DNA answered who killed Sherri Rasmussen. It also left a harder institutional question in view. Why did it take science 23 years to make the warning matter?